Oh, okay, I'm going to call the meeting to order, and the first thing, I see that John Orzak is our illustrious chief is on here, and for the minutes, congratulations, John. It just shows you again how good this city is, and how good the administration, both police, fire, and everybody is, that we get recognized. Sometimes we're our own worst critics, but congratulations, John.
Son.
I hope you heard it.
I bet he heard it. He said he was on. He texted me back saying he was on.
Okay. Okay, so the first thing is the approval of the August 21st minutes that were sent to you.
So moved.
Second.
Second discussion? None? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay. Hopefully, everybody has had a chance to look through this resource network plan that Michelle uploaded for us. And who's going to take the lead on this, Eric or Michelle?
Michelle.
Michelle.
And do you have a copy of it? I didn't. It's downloaded on my computer at work, but
Should have
obviously.
sent it in physical copies.
I didn't bring physical copies, sorry.
Okay.
I'm pulling mine up on my
Okay.
phone. Do you have a?
He's gonna
Ready? How
present
you
it.
doing?
He's gonna present though the whole thing.
Good to see you all.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what? I can get it off my cell phone.
It'll be on the screen.
Oh, it'll be on the screen?
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely.
all right.
But that, I was gonna follow along on my cell, just put the PDF up, but he will have it up on there as well.
Okay, we'll be good then. I know
Well,
what my question.
With my eyes, I wanted to, so I could see it.
I put this.
Yeah, well, I've got it on my.
In fact, I'm gonna run out to my
Blow it
car
up.
and get that.
So without further ado, I'll let Gordon Mann present the presentation on the 5-year forecast.
Thanks, Michelle. First off, can you guys all hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. All right, great. I don't know if, I'm not sure if you're looking at the camera or not. If you are, and you notice the very odd backdrop, just a word of explanation. I know Michelle and Eric have heard this before. I am in my car. I have 2 very small children in a very small house, and they're very loud. But I am not driving. So this This is my only private controllable space.
I know if I did this at home, it'd be the same way.
So coming to you from my my makeshift office. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share what we've been working on with you. I'm going to put the presentation up here for you. Right there, you should be able to see it. What I wanted to do this morning is a couple of things. One, I wanted to introduce who we are. I know we met a couple of you almost a year ago now, where we did our assessment visit. I'll explain a little bit what that is in October of last year. And we've been working with Michelle and Eric for a while, but the project and the analysis we've presented may be new to a lot of you. The second thing is we wanted to talk a little bit about what the financial impact has been of the coronavirus on Sandusky in 2020, and then talk a little bit about what we see in terms of the 2020 in terms of 2021 and what it means, what it potentially means for your budget process. So one other kind of last housekeeping note: if you're looking at the participants on the screen there and you see a couple of names you don't recognize, they're 2 members of our team. MB would be Meredith Brett, and AL would be Ashley Lewis.
Yeah, I think
right.
that was me.
So the Ohio State Resource Network is a follow-up to what was a national initiative in 2013. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development set this program up with the desire to help communities that receive Community Development Block Grant or CDBG funds get more value out of their money, get more bang for their buck. It was established with the understanding that the rising tide of the economic expansion kind of post-Great Recession did not lift all tides uniformly, and the interest in particular of providing additional technical expertise and kind of staff extension to small and medium-sized cities. That it's great that Columbus or New York City or San Francisco or whoever is doing well, But there's a lot more out there than those larger cities, and the other communities need and deserve support too. So with private funding, we launched what were called state resource networks, one of them here in Ohio, with the belief that rather than taking what you could consider a peanut butter approach where you would have X million dollars and do 60 engagements in 40 states, what if we concentrated our engagements in a handful of states? And so there's one in New Jersey, there's one in Massachusetts, and there's one here in Ohio. And part of the reason we picked Ohio, you can see their logo to the right here. I don't think we have anybody on the phone from the Greater Ohio Policy Center, but if you're familiar with them, they've been a great partner, and they've done a lot of work explaining and advocating on behalf of the smaller and mid-sized legacy cities here in Ohio. When we initially started this process, it was we had something very different in mind, right? So the way the process works, it's a little reverse of how you would normally do this type of technical service. The first thing is normally a city would have money in its budget, put out an RFP for consultants, pick the consultant, and go from there. Here, the process was a little bit reversed. There is a local contribution, but it's more than 75% grant funded or privately foundation funded. And the way the project worked is we put out a list of services. We issued what was called a request for assistance, saying, okay, Ohio communities, who out there thinks this might be useful? We received a very good response, considering it was the first time we've done this program in Ohio. And then we interviewed the applicants. We came to Sandusky and visited a number of other cities in the fall of last year, and we picked Sandusky. So it's a little reverse. And when we picked Sandusky, the concept was that we would do what's called a multi-year financial plan, really intended to build off of the end of your bicentennial vision. So you have that plan. It lays out the things that Sandusky is looking to accomplish, the types of investments you're trying to make, and you're coming up on the end of that plan. I think the last number of it is next year. And this was intended to be, from a city finance perspective, a follow-on to that. To basically say, okay, we've been investing more money in community and economic development. How can we make sure we maintain that? So that was our starting point when we started this engagement early this year. And obviously, a lot has changed. So if you're kind of following along in the book, this is page 7. We did a baseline assessment. I'll explain what that is in a little bit. We did that in January or February. It was supposed to provide our starting point for kind of outlining what we thought the city could and should do to sustain and maybe even increase its development and the type of things you're doing through Issue 8. And then in March, the whole world changed. So the coronavirus hit, news about Cedar Fairs having to open late, and the dramatic impact that has on city finances. So we pivoted from saying, okay, how can we make sure we maintain or increase the investments that the city's made through Issue 8, and still should be a goal of the cities, to saying, okay, how do we make sure that the city is able to sustain basic services in 2020, which Michelle and Eric have been very involved in with you, and what does this mean for 2021 and 2022? How quickly and what's the most responsible way to get back to the place where you're able to make the investments in your community that you need and not just keep the lights on? So that's how our engagement has pivoted. And today, you're looking at this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the baseline assessment. That assessment becomes a little less important now since it was written before the pandemic, but there are some key points to highlight there. We're going to talk specifically about what the impact has been on your finances, and then we're going to talk in terms of, okay, so what do we do about it? Today, we're going to limit that conversation to what have you done so far and what is that worth? I mentioned before that we chose Sandusky, that Sandusky applied for this competitive program, and we picked Sandusky, and we did it for a couple of reasons. All of our members, none of our members are from Ohio. I live in the suburbs of Philadelphia. We have other members from Washington, D.C., and from other parts of the country. We think Sandusky is great. We think it really has a lot going for it. beautiful amenities. We were there in the fall and February, so maybe February is not the most picturesque time of year for Sandusky, but even then, I mean, you could see the really great amenities that it has, natural amenities. We're also really just impressed by the cooperating and collaborating partnerships you have. Everywhere we go, we ask about partnerships. Everyone always says that they've got, stakeholder involvement. You've actually proved it. You've proved it by putting a plan in place. You've proved it by doing difficult things like passing issue 8 a number of years ago. And our belief is that the problems that city governments as institutions face are really complicated. And if city government as an institution by itself tries to fix them, that won't work. That you need the cooperation of the private sector, of other levels of government, certainly of citizens, and Sandusky has demonstrated the ability to actually do that. We are, I should mention, the part of the network that we're from is public finance focused. So I'm from a company called Public Financial Management, and our name is not creative, but it is descriptive. It's exactly what we do. And so we are numbers people, first and foremost, and we look at Sandusky both in terms of strengths and in terms of weaknesses and opportunities from a financial lens. And it's not the only lens. In some cases, it may not be the right lens, but we do sort of acknowledge that up front. And one of the things we liked about Sandusky from a finance perspective is your success in building your reserves, or what's called your fund balance. So you see on the chart here that those reserves took a dip as appropriate during the Great Recession. And before issue 8, they were okay. And then even with the investments you've been able to make, you've had a healthy reserve. The answer, well, how much reserve is enough? The standard here is generally 2 months is the minimum, or 16%. And the reason for that is a couple of things: cash flow needs, having something to draw on if you want to make strategic investments. And as we've all experienced over the last 6 months, because sometimes things happen and you need to be able to draw on those reserves. And the presence of those reserves is one of the real strong points financially of the city of Sandusky, if you're kind of looking at it from just an accountant's perspective. The second thing
If I could jump in about those reserves for a second.
Sure, please.
Michelle,
Yep, go ahead.
I apologize. You sent out the email yesterday. The notes were bought at a very good price, and it was looked at because the city has the reserves and we were forward thinking. Nobody saw the pandemic coming. I mean, that is what it is. But we did some things a few years ago with the reserves, with the stabilization fund and keeping our reserves up, that I think saved us with these notes, and I think that goes far along with what you're saying. Sorry to interrupt.
No, please do, because one of the wrinkles of this is when I have the presentation up, I can't see anything other than the presentation. So feel free to yell or holler or whatever you got to do to get my attention. The second thing that we really liked about Sandusky was the fact that you are making more investments in your infrastructure, your sidewalk, the boardwalk, blight elimination, transportation. You know, this kind of puts the numbers to this. These are the numbers from your audit where the auditor says, okay, we classified this as public safety and that is community development. You can see it was lower pre-issue 8. And again, it dipped during the Great Recession, and it's been higher since issue 8. And, you know, while we are public finance people, and that's, you know, the name of the company we represent, we strongly believe that government is not a purely financial institution. The reason you exist is not to push your fund balance as high as possible. You're not a bank. You're not trying to turn a profit. You have that money as stewards of it to do something with it, and we were encouraged by this picture. So the first thing we did, and Michelle has asked us to spend a little bit of time on this to explain the methodology, is this baseline projection. And what I'd say, you know, you saw the quote from Eisenhower earlier, the process is in some senses more important than the immediate conclusions. Having the process, thinking out over multiple years, updating with what you learn and what you know, that's more important in this process than looking at a number in 2024 and saying, okay, what do I think the city is really going to spend on police health insurance in 2024? You can do that. You're probably going to get it wrong. And that's not really the point. We do these baseline projections to identify challenges that are there, and this are challenges in this case before the pandemic. So The easiest way to describe this is when you want to test the alignment on your car, you're driving along, you take your hands off the wheel and it shifts to the left or the right, you know what you need to adjust. You don't do that because you're intending to drive without your hands on the wheel. You do that to identify challenges and then to adjust them. So the numbers you're going to see here, especially in the out years, 2023, 2024, 2025, this is a diagnostic exercise. This is not a prediction. It's going to show deficits that will not happen and would not happen in Sandusky. We've already talked about the fact that you've managed your finances well. You've established your baseline. There was no situation in which you were going to really run deficits for 5 straight years. That was not going to happen. But doing this diagnostic gives us a sense of, okay, what are the adjustments that we need to make, both where and how much? So we like long reports. This is a shorter version of a longer report, if you can believe it. The longer report has 10 key trends. I'm going to distill it down to really 2 or 3 here this morning. And the first one is in regards to your income tax. So you guys know that this is the horse that drives the cart financially for you. You can see the growth in the revenue kind of pre-issue 8. The revenues themselves were lower, but the growth rate was a little higher, 3.8%. CAGR is just annual, it's compound annual growth rate. And then from 16 and 19, you take 15 out of the equation because that's where you get that big jump when issue 8 comes into effect. The growth is much more modest. It's about 1.3% per year. It's below inflation. It's below the level of base wage increases that the city has provided. And this is kind of really what the city's largest revenue slide revenue has done in the leading up to the pandemic. Again, try and accelerate and skip some of these the slides here, let you look at them on your own time. This is what we look at from a finance perspective when you say, okay, revenues are only growing by 1.3%. Why? And the answer is the income tax base here, the earnings of people who live in Sandusky, and increasingly people who work in Sandusky, have been, as you can see, relatively flat. I mean, you can pick any 2 points on this graph here, and overall see that depending on what you pick, there's not a lot of growth here. If you look at the individual blocks, the green at the top, those are your highest earners. The blue at the bottom, those are your lowest earners. The percent of the part of the income tax base represented by the lower earners is shrinking. The part of the income represented by the higher earners is kind of stable. And we got numbers this morning that show that if you look at this differently, if you look at this in terms of where your revenue comes from, if I've got these numbers right, about $6 million is non-resident, so folks who work in Sandusky but don't live there. $2 million is Sandusky residents, and $2 million is corporate income tax withholdings. So it's very heavily weighted in people who drive into Sandusky, that even more so than the people who live in it. So the second thing, all right, our income tax is growing a little below inflationary levels. This is the admissions tax. So this comes, 99% from Cedar Point or Cedar Fair's facilities. And what you see here is 2 things. One, in terms of actual dollars, it's actually been shrinking. So 4.3 million in 16, 4.2 million in 17, 4.15 in 18, 4.08 in 19. So it's not a dramatic drop, but it's not increasing. So that's the first thing. And we talked a little bit with Eric and Michelle about why that might be. I don't think that's a reflection of flat or declining attendance at the park itself. It might be a reflection of shifts in how people buy the tickets, season passes versus one-time tickets, and how the tax is applied to those different things. But whatever's happening on the ground and in the park at Cedar Point isn't happening in your balance sheet, right? Your revenues there are, again, flat or declining. The second thing you notice is that 2020 was expected pre-pandemic to be a big year, right? So you see the big jump from around the $4 million mark to 4.75. And I think a lot of that was optimism about the anniversary celebration, some new rides opening. The reality, though, is because that optimism is there, because that's in your budget, because you were banking on almost $1 million increase, and it's going to go the other direction, that makes the pain a little sharper this year. So these are the overall revenue projections. You can see the growth rate, what we're projecting, and what it's been historically are, numerically exactly the same. So that's one side of the equation. This is the spending side, and we focus a lot on personnel costs because that's where most of your costs are, as is the case of just about every local government. These are the bar chart here is your spending on salaries and wages within the general fund. I should have mentioned that earlier, but we're focused almost predominantly on the general fund. We did look at a few others, your debt fund, your park and recs fund, your pension funds. But for the most part, we're focused on the one that funds operations. And what you see here is that spending on salaries and wages has, steadily increased. The number, if you calculate it out from 15 to 19, is 6.1% per year. You can see it goes 7.8 to 8.5 to 9.2, and the years where there's the biggest growth from a dollar amount perspective are the early years, and that's in line with issue 8, adding some more employees, doing some more investment. But this is kind of where things were headed pre-pandemic. You also see that 2020 number, just as you were anticipating a jump in your revenues, you're showing a pretty significant jump in your expenses as well. So just as the drop in revenue made that especially painful, the drop in spending will look good relative to the levels that are in the budget. If you're looking at this and going, oh wait, who's getting 6% annual wage increases a year? The answer is probably nobody. That's the contribution, or that's the spending across all employees in the fund. So as you add more employees, which the city has done, the salary spending goes up. And you can see again, this is a snapshot that's in the city's year-end audit. I think it's the number of positions in December of each year. So it probably misses kind of seasonal employees and those sorts of things. And you can see again, headcount dropped through the Great Recession, stabilized, and then made some additions in the early part of the issue 8, and then have kind of stabilized again. And this is all pre-pandemic. This is not what you have right now. The second thing that's harder to see on the spending chart, but equally important, is health insurance. And this one's, you might know this, but it's a little mechanically involved. So when you pass your budget and you have a line in there that says fringe benefits, those are not the actual spend. That's not the actual spending on health insurance for your employees. That's the general fund's contribution to a separate fund, what's called the self-insurance fund, which pays for health insurance. So over time, if you look at the table, the top line there, 16 through 19, the contributions from the general fund toward the cost of health insurance have dropped dramatically. $3 million in 16, 3.2 in 17, but then 2.7 in 18, 1.4 in 19, a little higher, 1.8. That's not because your health insurance spending itself has dropped. What happened is when you changed to a self-insured structure, you were very conservative, which was appropriate. You built up a big reserve in that fund, which was great. And now you're appropriately spending it down. You don't need a huge reserve in that fund. You don't want it to be zero because you're self-insured and you don't want to be in a situation where a bunch of people get sick. You don't have money to pay the doctors, but you don't need that to have a huge balance. So you've been spending that down, and that's fine. The way you've been spending it down is instead of making 12 months of transfers a year, you've made something less than 12 months. This year initially it was going to be 6.5. It may even be less than that. But this, as a result, results in this. Your spending pattern, if you look at it from 16 to 19, you conclude, well, we're barely growing at all, right? 0.8%. Most of that growth is in the first year with issue 8. But if we just take your health insurance spending and we just make it flat, which again isn't what it's actually been, your costs have been growing over time, the 0.8 turns to 3.5. So again, it's fine that you've been spending down that balance. That's appropriate, but it's made things look a little better in the general fund or a little lower in the general fund than they've actually been. And here's the rub. Eventually, that self-insurance fund doesn't have a balance anymore, right? If you're spending down the reserves, eventually the reserves disappear. And when we did this projection, we had projected that next year would be the year in which you would have to start making 12 months worth of contributions again. And that adds about $1.4 million to your budget overnight. Again, not $1.4 million in spending. You're already spending that just out of a separate fund. It adds it to the obligation for the general fund to fund it. So we add those two things together and we get this slide, which looks really scary. But again, I'm going to encourage you to almost ignore the numbers in 2023, 4, and 5, because that was not going to happen. Again, this is a baseline tool, not a prediction. You have a track record of good financial management. But what this tells us is, okay, even before the pandemic, 2021 was going to have some hard choices in it. And you were going to make them, and you were probably going to make them well, because that's what you guys have done. But if we say, boy, I can't wait for things to get back to normal and be what they were before COVID-19, and there's a lot of reasons to believe that, including not working out of your car, there still would be this financial question. There still would be this issue with the health insurance and the flat revenues to talk about. All right. So let's talk about what impact the coronavirus has had on you. And again, I'm going to accelerate here a little bit because a lot of this is stuff you know. You get most of your revenues from really two sources: the income tax and the admissions tax. Property tax is small for you guys. Lodging tax is about the same, and then everything else only adds up to 25%. And those three things: income tax, lodging tax, and even to a lesser extent, property tax and the admissions tax, they're all very tied to Cedar Fair. So, you can see the admissions tax comes almost entirely from Cedar Point. The lodging tax comes mostly from the hotel. The employment here, you look at that 48% number jumps out. That's not the percentage of your income tax that comes from Cedar Fair. That's the number of jobs, and I would imagine a lot of those are kind of low-wage seasonal jobs, and that pumps up the percentage. But it's still, that shouldn't be a dollar amount there. That should be 6,000 jobs, not $6,000. But it's a big part of your tax base. Again, you already know that. So what we have done over the last, really since about April, is working with Michelle and Eric, said, okay, what does the pandemic mean financially? And in April, Michelle provided you guys with two projections. One that was an optimistic scenario, that's the green column you see on the left, which was that Cedar Fair reopens in July and life goes back to normal. The other was a very pessimistic projection, which is Cedar Fair is not able to open at all. The optimistic scenario had a total loss of 4.6, a lot of it in the admissions tax, but some of it in the income tax. The pessimistic, the admissions tax is basically wiped out. So instead of getting that 4.75, you would have got pretty close to zero. You would have lost a big chunk of income tax, and that's a $10 million loss. It would have been great if the optimistic happened. Where you're going to land is somewhere in the middle. So Cedar Fair didn't open on July 1st, but it didn't stay closed all year. It did have a season, though it wasn't as long as originally projected. And as information about the park has come out, we've made adjustments along the way and said, okay, I think your revenues are likely to land here, and then here, and then here. And that's what we were referring to before, where the number we picked back in April or May or June was not as important as the process of committing to saying, okay, where are we headed now? And what you see there is it's a projected loss of about 12% on the income tax, a substantial loss to the admissions tax, close to $4 million. The lodging tax, not surprisingly, has similarly suffered. That's above $1 million. And then a couple of other things that really aren't on our radar and aren't as big from a dollar perspective, but are worth noting. Interest earnings for everybody are going to go down, either because you're spending your reserves or because interest rates are near zero or both. And that you have had some hits on the departmental revenue side. Municipal court in particular is about more than $500,000 lower. And if we add all that up, it's about a $7.1 million hit.
Mr. Chairman?
Stahl, you have a question?
Yeah, I did. And I'm sorry I forgot your name.
Oh, it's okay. It's Gordon. That's all.
I ran out to my car to get my cell phone when you were introducing yourself. And if you could do, first, my question from earlier I was going to ask, could you send us a copy or educational vitae so that we have that on file, what your background is? Because I really have no idea what your background is.
Sure, not a problem.
Although you're talking a good game. Now, my question at hand is, how current are these numbers? I live at Cedar Point. I drive through the parking lot every day. I have a pretty good idea what the numbers are, just based on the number of cars that are there. And I wondered how up to date your current is.
Sure. So we are the most recent numbers of actual revenue figures, and this is a really important point because I don't live there, right? And I could only go based off of the numbers that I see in a spreadsheet, and they absolutely will not be telling the full story, right? And so some reality adjustment here is appropriate, and you there locally will have to tell us how much. These numbers, the most recent full year of months you have, obviously, is August. We're in the early stages of September. We're midway through September. These numbers we vetted with Michelle last week, so they're at least the numbers themselves are not stale. And some of these numbers, I don't know. Obviously, again, I can't speak to the level of foot traffic at Cedar Point. But if you look at where the numbers have been from a lodging tax perspective, from an income tax perspective, if anything, they might even be a little optimistic based on based on what you've done so far. Now, maybe you're going to have a great September through December. Again, that's not traditionally a strong time of year for a seasonal park. But the revenues, again, particularly lodging tax and income tax, this is how you've been trending for the first 8 months of the year.
Have we crushed these numbers with Cedar Point? Are they aware and do they concur with these numbers?
I had a nice meeting. I happened to drop by, and Michelle happened to be in her office, a couple weeks ago. And we looked at some numbers, which I think we're going to share here in a little bit. I think Michelle is very much on top of, where things are going to be. I mean, obviously, she doesn't have a crystal ball any better than any of us else in the room. And Steve, I don't want you to go to jail, so I don't want you to tell us anything that you shouldn't. But obviously, weather's going to be a big factor in how people are going to accept the social distancing. But I think Michelle's put together, I think, some realistic numbers. I think, Eric, you've probably seen those, and I don't know if you agree with my comment. And I think.
Sure, and what you're seeing on the screen, like Gordon just stated, we're looking at these, on an ongoing basis.
Right.
So again, we don't have a crystal ball, but it seems that, the cooler weather has brought more people back to Cedar Point for the weekends, and that's what we were anticipating, that, the cooler weather, people are okay with wearing their mask in this cooler weather, so we'll see an increase in attendance hopefully from now until November 1st, so.
You didn't see it blowing northeast this morning.
Shut up, I got to get in a boat.
I've had videos sent to me already of the water.
I'm sorry, Eric.
No, I'm sorry, I just said of the wind. I've had people show me the water coming over the shore on video.
It's as bad this morning as it's been in a while. And I will tell you.
But I guess
when it's that bad, people don't show up. I've actually gone and counted cars at Cedar Point.
And Craig, I appreciate that. I mean, again, nobody has a crystal ball, and I think that's indicative. But I think Michelle's put together what in my opinion, are some good conservative numbers that shows us, okay, where we're going to be. Hopefully, we're going to get a couple of hits. We've got some funds from Erie County. Some of those things are going to help. Obviously, Eric, I think we chose to put those into police and fire, so our safety things, which I think was a great idea, because that's one of the things that suffered. If you remember, Greg, and whoever else is on here that may have been through the 2008 wars, that's where we suffered, and watching them close down a fire station, that hurt. So, Eric, I think the choice that you made was the right one. So.
I'm happy with the answer.
Okay. I'm sorry for interrupting, but it just.
No, it's your meeting.
Okay.
So the big question that I think Eric and Michelle and you guys and everybody else is wrestling with is, okay, when does this get back to normal, right? When is this over, and how quick is there a recovery? And again, I don't know Sandusky. I will never know Sandusky as well as you do, and I certainly don't right now. So you may have a better answer for that question. But what we look at as outsiders is a couple of things. We look at, okay, what are the projections from economists? I saw you had an economist from, I think it was Bluffton, who talked about the uncertainty. Nationally, economists are fairly negative. the folks at Moody's, who are some of the people who are involved in evaluating debt and credit ratings, they have a base case. So their starting point right now is that the national job market, so not specific to Sandusky, but national jobs won't recover until late 2023. And a severe case there, I don't know if you want to call it a worst case, but their severe case is early 2026. That's a really long recovery. We are not including we are not saying, okay, well, what happens if revenues don't rebound until 6 years from now? But that's what national economists are looking at. For you guys locally, because you don't live in the national, well, you do, but your local picture is more important than what's happening certainly somewhere else. What happened during the last recession is on the income tax, which is, again, the biggest driver of revenue here. It was about a 4-year cycle. In 2008, revenues were $7.6 million. They dropped to 9. That's right in the teeth of the Great Recession. The recession technically ends midway through 2010, but there's a lag until people come back to work. And then you see growth in 12, and you get back to life pre-recession 4 years later, so 8 to 12. This recession, again, very, very different in a couple of ways. It's service-based. The last recession was based on excess in manufacturing and excess particularly in the housing market. This one's service-based. It's based on a pandemic. It happened very, very quickly and sharply. And reopening, particularly if you are optimistic about the chances for a vaccine and the distribution of it, it could also happen certainly much more quickly than a housing crisis where you've got 100 homes that are foreclosed and waiting for somebody to buy them, right? So it's different, but our data points show, however we think about this, whenever the revenues are going to come back, it's probably not next year, right? You probably aren't back to pre-pandemic normal in 2021. And whether it comes back in 22 or 23 or 24, and that's what these different lines represent, we can think about that, we can argue about that, we can talk about that, but we do know it's not going to be back to your 25, or we're pretty confident it's not going to be back to $25 million next year, right? That there's going to be some sort of lag here. And even if you believe the economy will totally bounce back, the jobs will all return, everyone will go to the hotel, Cedar Point, its admissions will be as good as they've ever been. You have to remember, Cedar Fair offered a 2-for-1 deal. So some of those cars that you see in the parking lot today or tomorrow or on Sunday, they're not going to pay next year because they've already paid. So there's that sacrifice of upfront cash flow for next year's revenue. So instead of paying in 2020 and 2021, which was normally what would have happened, they're only going to pay once, and it was this year.
I'm going to correct you, and Mr. Samasula, you help me if I screw this up, okay?
Will do.
Obviously the revenues won't be there, but one of the reasons that they have the people there is silver passes, gold passes, whatever color. I apologize, I'm colorblind, but and that Cedar Fair has a formula for allocating when those passes will be recognized as income, and that's when the admission tax would be paid. Is that kind of a sum it up?
Yes. Yeah. And so you will get more revenue next year from those gold passes than you got this year.
Oh, great. Well,
Right. Just because the fact that.
I think you need to understand that basic financial premise. And Steve, I'm not, again, trying to ask anything out of school, but I think you've explained it to us extremely well, and that it's the spigot is not turned off, it's not going to turn on. It's going to be over a period of time. Is that with your accruals?
That is true. Yes.
Okay, I just want to make sure that I phrased that correctly.
Thank you very much. That's good and useful to know. And that you're not going to have a real set of 2021 numbers to kind of think and worry about until the budget, but that for our numbers here, it's possible they should come up in 2021. So that's good news. Okay, so this is less good news. So this is the baseline deficit, the challenge that we talked about with the relatively flat revenues in the health insurance. and then the loss of the revenues from the pandemic. And again, I'd encourage you to basically ignore 2023, 4, and 5 for now. Again, when we started this process, this was intended to be a 5-year plan to show what you are going to be investing over that period of time. So that's why we even have those numbers that are out there in this environment of uncertainty. But again, the number for 2020, we can continue to update that, but from our external perspective, whatever weight you put in that number looks pretty good. And next year, it's not that your revenues aren't going to come back. The revenues do come back, and maybe more than we're showing here. But you will also pick up some of the health insurance expenses. Your spending on health insurance now, I'll say, is lower than projected here in this baseline because 1, you have fewer employees, and 2, you have fewer people. People are going to the doctor less frequently. But we would expect that as things get back to normal, people are going to start going back to the doctor again too, right? That those procedures that you put off because of the pandemic, you're not going to decide, well, I'm just not going to get that fixed at all anymore. So let's talk a little bit about what you've done to date. Again, more stuff you already know. Most of your spending is on your employees here. Salaries and wages is about half, health insurance, other fringe benefits. You've got the transfers to the police and pension fund are in here. They're part of your general fund. You do have a separate fund that pay those, but you make a transfer to that. And your big challenge here, even pre-pandemic, is you have a economy that's not entirely. You do have other things. You have the Firelands Medical Center. You have a significant manufacturing sector. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that we think you're, Seaside Heights, New Jersey, or something, or where you're totally seasonal. But you do have more revenue come in the summer, and the services you provide are year-round, obviously, right? You need a police department and a fire department and public services and all that stuff all year round. Whether there's people coming to Cedar Point or not, you need those services. So that's in essence your challenge. And even if nobody shows up for the park, and that hasn't happened, but even if nobody showed up for the park in that pessimistic scenario and your admissions tax dropped to 0, you'd still have to fund your police and your fire department. You couldn't send 60% of your fire department or police department home.
I'm going to stop you for a minute, please.
Sure.
During this whole process, you mentioned once the hospital, Firelands Regional Medical Center, only because I'm a director and see the numbers, is a nothing to the contribution that Cedar Fair has, okay, but is a substantial contribution to the city, and you seem to ignore that.
Oh no, I don't mean to ignore that. We actually had this whole separate section of the process that involved speaking with the other economic stakeholders, and they were involved with that.
Okay.
So I recognize the important contribution they make. Just again, from a finance perspective, they don't add anything to your admissions tax, right? They don't add anything to your lodging tax, and those are big chunks of your budget.
No, but I know what the income tax we pay.
Oh, and I'm sure yes, and I'm sure it's significant, and even on an average, if you look on an average job basis, I'm sure it's much higher than the jobs at Cedar Fair. So no, I don't mean to downplay the importance of that. And partially when we started this, one of the goals was to work with the economic stakeholders, and this was a different member of the network, but to talk about how to diversify the economy even more, right? To what would you need for more growth in the medical industry? What would you need for more growth in the manufacturing industry? So again, kind of pre-pandemic, that was the starting point for our focus. Let's talk a little bit about the changes you've made to date, and these. This is just, in essence, putting numbers to them. In fact, well, I guess I'll leave this up here because I can't look at 2 screens at the same time in my car. But you did have some positions you've eliminated, mostly in the general fund, but not all of them, and that's a really important point. When the savings you get here, your accounting happens in different buckets, right? The general fund funds operations, other funds fund other things. So if you have a position in the sewer or the water system that you eliminate, that's fine. That may save money, but it doesn't close your general fund yet. But you did make a number of reductions. I think it's 13, 14. It might be a little higher than that in the general fund. And those are positions where people left midway through this year, so not January 1st, Some of them have had some sort of severance payment, but the assumption for right now is that those jobs aren't going to come back, at least not until revenues do. And that's worth, once you take it on an annual basis, it's worth about $700,000 to $800,000 a year. You do have some positions that were in the general fund where you've changed the structure, the funding for that a little bit. You know, the people are still there; they're still doing their jobs, but they're funded a little differently. You had a wage cut for your non-union employees, different levels at different salaries. Your health insurance spending has dropped, as we mentioned before. Again, some of that is probably pandemic related. Some of that is having less employees, but that's going to save you some money this year and hopefully into the future. You've made some changes, some other proactive changes. You got a reduction in everything that's not personnel, right? So I think the number we have here is about $600,000. And again, if you make reductions in the sewer fund, the water fund, the capital funds, those may be good and necessary, but they don't close the general fund gap. You did have $720,000 in the budget for neighborhood street paving this year. My understanding is that's not going to happen. You need less money in the Parks and Recs fund. You know, less of those activities are happening. The CARES Act funding that you just discussed, it's the $757,000. You also have, I believe, some additional funding that's going to help with the city's contribution to the public transit system this year and next year. And then the last thing that will happen here is kind of automatic. Your transfers from the general fund to the capital fund, the money you put towards issue 8 is tied to how much revenue you collect. So if you have a bad year on the admissions tax side or the income tax side or the lodging tax side or all three, the transfers will drop as a result. And that just kind of happens automatically by virtue of the way the process is set up. So we take all those numbers, we start with the $7.1 million hit, which again, may be better than that. We'll continue to monitor that and work on updating those numbers with Michelle. Hopefully it's better than that, but that's the number we have right now. We have the reduction in kind of people, whether it's the wage cut or the positions being vacant or the health insurance spending, and you can see that we project to kind of carry forward. You have the non-personnel spending. The biggest chunk of that is the paving this year. $720,000 of the 1.8 is that one line. You have about the $1 million in federal CARES Act support, $750 for public safety, $250 or so for transit, and then you have kind of the automatic reduction in transfers because your revenues are lower. And where we show you landing for this year right now, and it could be better than this, is about a $2.5 million deficit. So if we go all the way back to the beginning, where we talked about your reserves, they were across all funds that are like the general fund, so not just the general fund, but the payroll stabilization fund and whatever else your accountants basically grouped together with that. It was around $6 million. So you can absorb this hit. I don't know that you want to go a whole lot lower than this for the reason you mentioned earlier, the benefit for the credit ratings. Heaven forbid we have a second coming of the coronavirus next year and things shut down again. But you do have the reserves to cover that this year. And again, the 23, 4, and 5 numbers, I would say don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about those or thinking about those right now. The column that really does deserve some attention and some discussion is the 2021 numbers, right? So we have this challenge where your revenues are going to come back, but we're not projecting them to come all the way back next year. You are going to have to put more towards health insurance, we think, out of the general fund next year than this year. And you do have, police, firefighters, they already have a wage increase in their contract for next year. I think it's 3%. So you have this kind of, the confluence of those factors will make the 2021 budget process pretty difficult. And some of what you've done already will help, assuming you don't, and I don't sense that you would do this, but assuming you don't on January 1st fill every vacant position and bring everything back, right? And you're not going to do that. But you will have some of the actions you've taken already will help close next year's gap. Some of them won't, right? Unless there's a third or fourth or fifth round of the CARES Act funding, and maybe there will be, I don't think you can bank on $750,000 coming in to pay for police and fire in 2021, right? I don't think that's a reasonable assumption. Some of these things you want to bring back. The $720,000 that you didn't do on paving, you don't want to never do that again. You want to put that back in your budget, probably phased over a period of time as your revenues come back. But if we take the impact of just what you've done up to today, and 2021 hasn't even started yet, it shows you with a deficit kind of similar next year to this year. And so that's where we end this part of our analysis. The next step would be, okay, well, so now what? If I have a $2.5 million deficit, first of all, is that really where I'm going to end 2020? Is it going to be better? Is it going to be worse or not? Continuing to monitor and adjust those numbers. The second thing is, okay, I think we could reasonably assume if you do nothing, you would have a deficit next year. You're not going to do nothing, so what do you want to do, right? What are your options and what are they worth? And not just what are they worth next year, although next year is obviously the most immediate, but how does it address any deficit in the future? Not because we're trying to solve the 2025 deficit in 2020 in the middle of a pandemic. That's not the way to approach this. But because you want to get yourself in a position where as soon as the revenues do rebound, as soon as things are back to normal, you're completely ready to start making those investments in community and economic development again. And as much as you can control, you're not in a position where you're saying, all right, everything's back to normal, the economy's come back around, but I still need another 1, 2, 3 years to build up my reserves and catch my breath. We're trying to minimize that sort of lag so that you can get back on track with the investments that you want to make. That, I believe, is the end of the presentation.
Mr. Chairman, I have two quick questions for you. One is, I believe we got a CARES Act funding earlier this year, as you noted, went to police and fire of $750,000 or thereabouts, correct?
Yes. And it was 2 rounds, so we
But
initially,
the total is,
757,000.
okay.
There's rumors of a 3rd round coming.
But
Nothing's
boy,
finalized.
I listen to CNBC driving around all day. I think it depends on who gets elected, because I'm not so sure there is another CARES Act thing coming. I don't think you can bank on that. That's what
I don't think we're banking on that. So
No.
the way I look at the numbers, that's not
No.
you're not saying that's a given that it's, I have an innate right to get this. This would be something, again, as it came in, Ms. Whoopsie, you, I think very wisely, you and Michelle put in to our safety services. And I can't stress that enough, because I said it killed me to watch them close the fire station out there. Just that was, safety comes first.
So
And we want to do all these other programs, but safety's got to be first.
And to that point, through the chair, to Craig's question, we do have the existing CARES funding that we received as part of that, the reductions to that $7.1 million deficit that gets us to 2.5. What we don't have is any anticipation of new stimulus funding, which would put us in a better situation if it did come through. We're not counting on it at this point, just because it's too speculative.
Yeah,
At this
that's a
time.
good call. My next question, Mr. Chairman, was, we looked at these numbers yesterday. I know we probably all parsed some numbers around in our head. Do we need to have a meeting to talk about these numbers? Are we comfortable with these numbers? Do we endorse these numbers?
I think this is a working project.
Agreed.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Michelle and Eric. It's a working mechanism. In other words, this is a blueprint to start working off of, okay? That we build from there, okay? And I don't know exactly where you build from there. That's why you get paid, I get paid nothing, okay? But it's, no, but it's a blueprint to work off. And again, I had the pleasure of stopping in and having a chat with Michelle about a number of things. And I think they're on the right track, okay? I'm not qualified to say it needs to be this line item, that line item, or that. Having said that, what I did say to Michelle, and I know we're going to get into the budget and we're talking about reductions, is we talked about casualty insurance, okay? That it's going through the roof. All of you that were in the process here a few years ago Dan mentioned, we got somebody that works with Savista that does all of the stuff for the hospital, Crane Langer. They came in, got us out of the Borma pool for hospitalization, and we saved a bunch of money. I think, or at least my recommendation is going to be, and I got had Dan send the contact to Michelle, that we at least have them come in and take a look at our insurance and say, okay, this is what we can save. The person who's looking at it right now is a salesperson, okay? And it's like letting the fox in the hen house, where Crane Langer is a totally independent company. They don't make a dime off of no matter what we do, okay? And again, I think there's a lot of things that we can do to save some dollars, okay? So, we're looking to save every line item. And Eric, I don't want to get into your anything that you're doing, but I think, Michelle, that would be a very smart thing to do. And
Yep.
I said, what we saved in hospitalization the last time getting out of the Borma pool was just tremendous.
Unbelievable.
And those folks were very helpful.
Yes, yeah. And I work with them, both Savista and with the hospital. And again, they're watching the dollars, and then people know that they're watching it and they're independent. So if they step on somebody's toes, well, so be it.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
something that we all probably are and need to be cognizant of is our surpluses vary throughout the year, spring, summer, winter, and fall. I have heard from my fellow commissioner, Commissioner Murray,
Is now exiting.
the variance of those reserves could dramatically impact us in this pandemic. In other words, we swing as much as $2 million from winter, summer, spring, and fall. If that hits at the wrong time, we are literally out of money. So I think I know Michelle knows that we need to somehow program that in. The conclusion that our friends make is that we can absorb this $2.5 million hit. And I believe that we can. If it really is $2.5 million, I'm optimistic it might be slightly less than that. But the reality is, if our surpluses are at a low point, which they usually are come March or April, we could still not have cash to fund daily operations out of our surplus. Seems bizarre, but just look historically at how our reserves float from year to year over the seasonal period of time. So I mean, that's something we need to pay close
The
attention
basic
to.
cash flow analysis needs to be,
Yeah.
based on, and again, sorry, Mr. Brady, but we look at this, this was what our cash was due, and you do a great job with that. And again, we have that stabilization fund that has helped us this year. Michelle and I had a conversation the other day that, it's going to take us through, but we're going into 21, and you correct me when I'm going the wrong year. We still have some retired payments that'll come out, okay? But we still should have a couple $100,000 in there at the end of the year, if my memory serves me correct. And then that should take care of what we're going to get hit with in January or February. So though I agree with you, timing-wise, also what's changed things is when tax returns are filed.
Sure. And when Cedar Point opens up and by August, September, presuming we have another normal year or some kind of a normal return of normalcy, cash flow comes again. My concern is that dip. If that dip stays historically the way it is, we'll have to pay attention to that.
Mr. Chairman. Back in the Great Recession, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Waddington will remember, you'll remember, we spent a lot of time working on this report right here.
Yes.
And this should be the first report that Eric and you and Michelle look at every month, because it tells you.
I don't know what you're holding up there.
This is a cash balance
Okay,
report
yes,
by
okay.
month. And it compares it to other months. This is the greatest snapshot exists in the accounting department at City Hall. But
we're cash basis.
we were aware of this in the Great Recession, and this is what came out of that. And it's a great piece of work. This piece of work is so good that we took this piece of work and this piece of work exactly as it sits at the top third. is now used by the Area Regional Ottawa Mental Health and Recovery Board. It's the exact same thing, and it's cheated right off here. It's a great report, and we always felt that we had enough backing that with this report.
And I appreciate that.
We put a lot of work in that.
Yeah, sure.
Mr. Brady, do you have anything? Because I guess Mr. Murray is on now and wants to, Dennis, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you. I've been present throughout.
I can't hear him. I'm sorry.
Hey, Dennis, we can't hear you.
See him.
But we can't hear you.
Yeah, I've got it on, so.
I'm sorry, I can't.
See,
hear
I
you.
wonder if he should use his phone and mute the speaker.
I can hear you a little bit, Dennis.
Dennis, if you use your speaker, if you mute your speaker and your microphone and you call in, we might be able to hear you better from your phone. It might be your computer, because I remember this happened the last time from this location as well.
Phones work better.
If you find the room empty, we adjourned. But again, I think to Mr. Stahl's point, we're a cash basis business, okay? And yesterday I had a whole conversation about an accrual basis business, and so they're different.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, while we're waiting for Mr. Murray to call in, I just want to make comments that we are in the process of working on the 2021 budget. Departments are submitting their requests for next year. So we're obviously in that time of year again already somehow that we'll have the budget back to you in October. So next month already. So we'll be talking a lot between now and then about the
Even if
budget.
it's a highline budget, and we know that the first shot through is.
Yep, that's where we'll be for next month. And just to your point about property and casualty insurance, we are working on that. The renewal date's December 1st, so we're getting our quotes and everything, and we'll have as many people involved in that process to make sure we're leaving no rock unturned. We're going to get the best pricing
I
with
just
the
want to
best
make sure you were
results.
aware of a service that was out there that we used previously that was very successful.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. My next comment too is also that on Tuesday of this week, the state of Ohio approved another clean audit for 2019, so we're very thankful for that. I'm thankful to the staff here, especially Sally Martin and Heather Turner, who helped tremendously get us through that 2019 audit as I was just coming in January this year. So we're very thrilled with that. The CARES Act funding, I had a note on that. So
The management letter that went along that was about as benign as you could get. There were just some basic housekeeping things that you were probably on top of already.
Absolutely. There was a mention of the credit card statement and the credit card policy and the way we handle credit cards. It was just an issue we have always had the department heads have in their possession the credit cards. The policy that's been in place stated that the finance department held all credit cards, so we're going to get that cleaned up.
Dennis Murray.
I think that's just a matter of cleaning things up and,
Is now joining.
Dennis is joined.
okay, Dennis, let's try it again.
Thank you.
Now we can hear you.
Sorry, I don't know why that happened. Okay, so an observation and two requests for information. I think it's important to think in terms of the presentation we've just received, in terms of both the immediate impact on our budget from the pandemic, and then taking a longer-term view, which is what this was originally designed to do. But the noise from the pandemic is kind of obscuring part of what I think is what the point that Gordon is making, and that is that even without the pandemic, had we maintained a rosy economy, we were headed toward having to make some structural adjustments at some point in time. Stated otherwise, we have a population base that cannot afford the services that we provide today. And we're on an unsustainable course given a relatively low income population, given a population that only pays about 20% of the income taxes. And so we're going to have to be some structural realignments that we're going to make in the future, whether that's a reduction in services and enhancement in revenue. I don't know which one that was, but something was going to have to give. So with that in mind, there are two requests that I would have. The trend number 6 has a combination of increases from wages, both in terms of additional people and the baseline wage increases. To the extent that that could be separated out, and we could look at those, particularly the wage increases. And I think we know what the union increases are, but it'd be helpful to be able to look at that and then compare that with our long-term revenue increases, because I think that that's where the collision occurs. And so the other thing that I wanted to be able to ask, and I don't know if you're able to provide that, but it would be helpful to see some normative data from other communities, mostly Ohio. What are the comparables in terms of the percentage of various revenue sources, various tax sources, various expenditure levels by population? Probably by population is going to be the most useful. So I think if we get some more normative data, we would have a little bit more information available to us in terms of next steps and decisions to make down the road. So I thank you for the opportunity.
I think those are very valid points, and that's something I picked up on too, Mr. Murray, is that even without the pandemic, we had to keep our eye on the ball because we were not going in the right direction. I mean, the city is just not growing the way we would love it to. I mean, it is beautiful. We got people coming in, but the population is not growing. I'm sorry, okay.
My kids are doing their part. I have a granddaughter, a month old now.
So, we're going to change the income tax ordinance. Anything over 10 days gets taxed.
They're moving to Rocky River tomorrow.
You still there, Dennis?
Well, I would note it. Yeah, I would, yes, and I would note that there is a very severe threat on the horizon in terms of a bill in the legislature that would be designed to cause those employees who work from home to be able to recognize their income in that location. So, that given that our residents only pay about 20% of the overall income taxes, any significant, a bill like that could be catastrophic to our budget.
Yeah.
You are correct.
We have a lot of things to manage through, Mr. Wupser.
True.
But again, I don't know if you heard, Dennis, we discussed this as a blueprint to start with, to go from there. And again, I don't know what you did and didn't hear, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself.
Thank you. I was here for the whole presentation, so I got it. Thanks.
And through the chair to Dennis and obviously everyone, we are committed, and I think we actually have a little bit more time with Gordon and his team, as well as this finance committee and myself, Michelle, is to looking at various options that look to what are different impacts that various revenue streams would have to help with this. And they certainly all don't have to be a tax increase necessarily, but are there other ways to bring in new revenue that would help in addition to if we do, and some of these structural things that Gordon brought up in his presentation, Michelle and I were both well aware of, and we're already kind of planning to steer the ship slowly. And what we did think though, going into 2020, based on the influx of the Cedar Point Sports Center, which we never really got to see the impact that was going to have on revenue, or the 150th. We don't think revenue was actually going to be flat this year, and it was not coming in flat in the first quarter. So we do think that there were signs of growth before COVID hit. That being said, we don't take that for granted coming out of COVID because we don't know what that's going to look like now. Well, we don't get the luxury of rewinding, but I do think we want to come back to this committee soon this year and talk about, once we have a little bit more information as to revenue, where it did come in, expenses where they came in, and say, okay, looking into the future, here is how we would manage expenses, and here are some potential creative opportunities to inject revenue that is just, and none of which are presented as a major suggestion, but are presented instead as things for this committee to consider, things for the city commission to consider, and things for us to discuss with the community as to, as Dennis mentioned and Dick mentioned, what are the package of services that we can provide within the revenue that we're likely to have not only next year, but over the next, several years going
I
forward.
don't think there was any major surprise coming out of this report. I think it's just justified where we're going and kind of what we figured out already. I mean, I said, I think this is a good blueprint. Mr. Murray, anything?
Nothing further, thank you.
Michelle, I had already put in there about the audit and the management letter, okay? I was going to discuss that too, so again, I've probably said this more times. I've been chairman way too long, okay? But I am incredibly proud of the accounting department here at the city of Sandusky through numerous finance officers. We always seem to come out very well on our audits, and I cannot remember any problem audit other than, no, I cannot remember anything that would rise to anything but stellar audits. And I'm getting old and forgetful. I can't remember how many years in a row we've gotten our certificates, but it's been a lot, okay? And again, I want to congratulate you and all the people in the department, again, for what I consider, a great job, particularly for you just jumping on at the end. And Ray and Associates, when I had talked to them for their, conversation with me, and they said everything was going in the right direction, and that the management letter were things that you've already addressed. And again, I saw nothing there that would cause me heartburn.
Absolutely. Thank you. I appreciate it. Through you, Mr. Chairman, I just have a couple other notes. You did touch on the various purpose notes that we issued yesterday.
Yes.
But for the rest of the people that weren't aware, we issued $8,070,000 worth of various purpose notes yesterday, and they sold at a premium, 1.5% coupon, but our net interest cost was 0.276.
I mean, that's free money.
Yes, and our municipal advisor said yesterday this is the lowest rate he's seen in the state of Ohio. So we are very fortunate. We went through the process with Moody's. We had those notes issued. And at the time, they gave us a MIG-1 rating, which is the highest rating. So again, it goes back to the factors that, we have been financially sound, and we're going to continue to do the best to be financially sound in the future. But that rating from Moody's at that time was what helped us with that sale yesterday.
COVID's going to hit all of us, okay? It's how we manage through the COVID. And
Sure.
I think Moody's sees that, particularly with the rating. And I've preached this for years that, the reserves and the different things that we have done made Moody's very, very happy. I got the pleasure, I don't know if you knew Michelle, but Moody's actually visited us last year. Actually came in, had a nice chat with them. For the first time, they instead of on the telephone, they came. Matt
Took them to lunch.
Yeah, well, Matt Lasko got a bus, and we took them around the area and showed them, what we were doing. They were impressed about how a city our size is reaching out and developing the downtown. But we're not only the downtown, but just the general area. And then we went down to lunch at the marina. They picked up their own tab. I picked up my own tab. Nobody would buy anybody's lunch, okay? So, but no, they just sat there. And one comment that I've made for a lot of years, and people that live on Cedar Point, God's only going to make so much water, and that's why we have to use it. We've got a waterfront, and I think that's a big draw. And that was their comment.
Absolutely. To be completely transparent, so we did get the highest rating on the various purpose notes. However, Moody's did downgrade us overall as a city.
Right.
We went from a double A3 to a single A1,
Right.
which is the smallest downgrade that they could have done. And as Eric and I talked with them, they said, unfortunately, it's just the effects of the pandemic right now, and we rely heavily on the tourism industry. So they were specifically targeting that industry. That's why they came back after us and wanted to look at us and re-rate us.
That does not bother me, okay? I mean, obviously, any kind of down, but with COVID going on, to me, that's minimal. Mr. Waddington?
Yeah, my big concern is, and I've mentioned it at the commission meetings, is the census. We're low right now as far as our community. If we do drop below 25,000, that's going to have a big impact on community development, block grant funding, other funding, as far as being recognized in the state. And Mr. Murray's still on. He was a state rep. Maybe he could mention the impact, and maybe that should be factored in to next year and following year. If that comes back, we have to live with that for 10 years. Mr. Murray, I don't know if you heard me or not. There it is.
Mr. Waddington, I did, Mr. Chair, with your permission, I did hear, and I completely agree with Mr. Waddington that if we drop, sometimes there's some programs where if you have historically been above the $25,000 person mark for a short period of time, you can remain that. But the problem is that we then lose the direct access to the CDBG grant, and there are some other funds that flow. I think some of the transportation funds flow through that or over that mark. So, yeah, that's very worrisome, and it's one more reason why we absolutely need to grow our population base any way we can. Another 5,000 people would cure all the problems we have.
Thank you. Okay, Michelle, anything?
I've got one last note. I'm working on requests for qualifications for an investment advisor, and Al and I spoke about this, so we're going to email this out next week so that we didn't have to discuss it on today's meeting, knowing it was going to be longer than normal. But it'll be coming in everyone's email. This will just be the request for qualifications. We'll have to publish this, and we'll get that out. Once we get the qualifications back, we'll obviously come to the committee and review this before any decision's made.
This gives us a chance to review it before the October 23rd meeting, and again, I will push Dan to be very hard to, he'll review it. Dan's very on top of that, and so we will take a look at that. So look in your inbox, and yeah, don't let it go to spam.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Michelle.
Absolutely. The other note I wanted to note on Gordon's presentation, the full-time equivalent employees, the numbers he had obviously have changed since COVID has happened. So the numbers on the screen were about 190. We're down to about 170-ish employees that are funded from the general fund. So that was, a big change from the numbers that we had previously.
Thank you. Mr. Wipser?
Thank you. Thank you for your time today. And
Okay, Mr. Waddington, anything? Mr. Brady?
Good meeting. Good information.
Anybody that's on the illustrious screen up there, anything further?
Good.
Okay, again, thank you very much for your time. I know these extra meetings are time out of your schedule, and as I indicated, October 23rd will be our next meeting, and I think this has worked out well. You'll stay on top of it, and we're here to help.
We appreciate it. Thank you.
Meeting adjourned.
Good, thanks.